All right, good morning, everyone. I first want to begin by, of course, thanking the Bartram Trail Conference and the Fothergill Award for funding part of the research that I'm going to be discussing today. So this talk is drawn from a chapter of my in-progress book manuscript, which is titled Curious Species, How Animals Made Natural History, 1700 to 1820. And what I'm trying to do in this book is to really make animals like corals, rattlesnakes, raccoons, and many others the central protagonists of 18th century natural history. And so William Bartram is just one of the many different naturalists that I draw on to try to sort of piece together an animal's eye view of Enlightenment science. I also actually want to begin with a content advisory that I've learned from personal experience I need to give before I talk about rattlesnakes. So if this slide did not tip you off, I'm going to be showing lots of snake images today. If you have a phobia, you've been warned. Though I think you're going to find that Billy Bartram's account of Puggy's rattlesnake encounter last night is a really fitting sort of appetizer for some of the themes I'll be discussing today. So without further ado, call her 111-1A. Sometimes catalog numbers are the only names we have. She's been folded accordion style in a bottle of liquor for close to 3 centuries, if not longer. Bleached scales encase her skin like a coat of armor. Turn her transparent tomb, and a surgical slit running the length of her body grows conspicuous. Through this opening, 111-1A was prepared for the afterlife, and perhaps emptied of her young, had she been pregnant, as naturalists often removed fully formed offspring from reptiles like this species that hatched eggs within their bodies. Trace the curves of her form from her head to her curious terminus at the bottom of the bottle, and an appendage appears like an ear of corn, identifying her to even an untrained eye as a rattlesnake. Now, some would say she shouldn't exist. Several faded labels at the top of her bottle bear the name Sir Hans Sloane. Sloane, a London naturalist who collected everything from purses made of asbestos to manuscripts on snake charming, amassed thousands of animal specimens that are almost entirely lost today. After Sloane died in 1753, his collections laid the foundation for the British Museum, which is regarded as the world's first public museum. By the early 19th century, however, a series of naturalists and keepers at that institution set out to torch the bulk of his zoological specimens, calling their yearly quasi-ritualistic burnings cremations. And in the words of one witness, these bonfires produced a pungent odor of burning snakes. Animal specimens from Sloane's founding collection, like this bleached serpent then, have been somewhat of a white whale for museum staff and curators, elusive but eagerly sought. And the morning of the day that I met 111-1A, the curator told me there were no 18th century serpents in the museum's collection at all. A Sloane specimen had not even been on my mind. Fortunately, a little digging in the institution's basement revealed both the curator and I to be wrong, as it turned out they had a whole cache of centuries-old rattlesnake specimens. And although 111-1A might not look like much, this snake is a relic of a contentious 18th century debate about the nature of animal power in the New World and of uniquely American rattlesnakes in particular. And Hans Sloane played a special role in the history of rattlesnakes, as he provided one of the first alternative explanations for these snakes' supposed capacity to enchant or charm or fascinate, all words that referred to the snake's supposed capacity of compelling small animals and sometimes even humans towards them. Sloane suggested that the paralyzed squirrels and birds involved in these encounters were simply succumbing to the effects of the snake's venom. But many more people disagreed, especially those who claimed to have themselves been charmed and immobilized by these snakes, sometimes simply by locking eyes with them. They believed in more mysterious forms of non-human influence, ones that remained ultimately inaccessible to human investigation. And I'll return to the subject of enchantment shortly and the role of both John and William Bartram in it. Rattlesnakes were perpetual fodder for conversation and confrontation among Europeans, settlers, Native Americans, and enslaved Africans alike. While snakes provoked scientific curiosity, they also produced rich biblical and political symbolism that could be difficult to disentangle from their physical being as animals. They signified the New World status as both Eden and hostile wilderness, and they became distinctly American emblems, even as bounties were being offered for their bodies. Interactions with rattlesnakes generated an uneasy coexistence of imagery and experience. So it's perhaps unsurprising then that almost all existing historical studies of rattlesnakes in early America tend to approach the animals as symbols or some sort of surrogate for the human imagination. The historian Thomas Slaughter, for instance, said of rattlesnakes in early America and the special relationship John and William Bartram had with them, quote, "Snakes were the least of it, but the symbol is stronger than the serpent itself." Now, in the words of the naturalist Ted Levin, the rattlesnake's rattle is arguably the most novel appendage in the animal kingdom. To 18th century observers, its uncannily loud and foreboding sound seemed to be a built-in alarm system crafted by God to protect people. And in fact, most biologists do believe that the rattle evolved to ward off predators. The rattlesnake, then, is this uniquely kind of semiotic animal. Its shaking rattle, in the words of William Bartram, appears like a vapor. Perhaps because it is this signifying animal, the rattlesnake's iconography and symbolism have proven so potent in the historical memory of early America that scholars have at times missed the vibrant material rattlesnakes as actual beings at the center of scientific and political discourse, as well as the web of indigenous knowledge that underwrote the study of these animals. Rattlesnakes have proven particularly elusive to historians and were likewise elusive to early modern observers for reasons that derive in large part from the snake's biology and the visceral, mind-altering effects they could enact on human bodies. For centuries, human interactions with these animals have been predicated on fear, destruction, and revenge directed at very real rattlesnakes. Their history is haunted by loss. Yet some of this loss, as I'm going to be discussing soon, has actually been a purposeful design by some people to shield snakes from further harm. There's this new field called agnotology in sort of historians and scholarly circles. It's the study of how ignorance and doubt gets manufactured and spread. And it's often been framed in more nefarious terms, say in relation to climate change denial or tobacco marketing. But ignorance and secrets could also serve righteous ends in the minds of historical people, as I'll show. 111-1A might have been a lost serpent, but in some sense, it's the very nature of a rattlesnake to get lost. They are master hiders. Most of a rattlesnake's life unfolds beyond the bounds of human experience and oversight as it curls up with relatives in a subterranean den, safe from the frost of winter. Rattlesnake's perceptual world is alien to us, made of vibrations, pheromones, and infrared signals. It's easy to be sort of hypnotized by the metaphorical language used by writers in the 18th century, but their metaphors for snakes often had material meaning and proceeded from actual snake behavior and natural history. Rattlesnakes, in this sense, co-authored the metaphors. The language of subterranean worlds, recesses, and crypts used by European and native commentators alike on rattlesnakes fit quite naturally with snakes who lived in darkness much of the year, who communicated and forged communities via channels invisible to people, and who crept along the ground on a different plane from human existence. The snake in the 18th century had not yet shed its symbol like a skin, but that doesn't mean everything was simply a symbol. Early American observers were sort of self-consciously struggling to disentangle the semiotics of serpents from the animals themselves. And it was fear of snakes and their bodily consequences that helped submerge rattlesnakes' history and natural history, because some naturalists were perfectly happy to avoid studying rattlesnakes. Not knowing these animals could yield safety. As William Bartram wrote in his travels, one encounter he had with a rattlesnake, quote, deterred us from proceeding on our researches for that day. But these fears also made Europeans and settlers sort of uncomfortably aware that they were not these disembodied minds contemplating nature from afar. Rather, they were animal bodies too, engaged in acts of mere survival. Moreover, such fears made them often question if their own methods of understanding animals were really any more empirical or distanced than those of Native Americans. Europeans relied upon the labor and the environmental knowledge of indigenous peoples at every turn, but they also often endeavored to distinguish themselves from those bodies of knowledge, and as scholars such as Jean O'Brien and Patrick Wolfe have shown, tried to rhetorically and physically rid natives from the land to make way for European and American territorial expansion, perhaps seen most visibly through forced 19th century removal of tribes throughout the Southeast. Extermination campaigns leveled at Native Americans and uniquely American animals were part of a related process. And among animals, rattlesnakes were particularly threatening, not only for their deadly venom, but because as subterranean beings, they ruled the very ground beneath settlers' feet, land settlers wished to claim for themselves. In the late 18th century, a Philadelphia naturalist named Benjamin Smith Barton wrote numerous articles about rattlesnakes, and he reserved particular venom for these tales of enchantment or fascination that I referenced. And in fact, William Bartram proved to be an important informant for Barton's own theories on the subject. Benjamin Smith Barton proclaimed snake studies to be really an exceptional science, one uniquely troubled by the difficulties of understanding its subject matter. He wrote, "The truth is that there is no branch of natural history in the investigation of which even men of science have more prominently discovered their ignorance and weakness than in that of the serpents. Here, even a Linnaeus, forgetting the cautious dignity which became the character of him who was destined to reform the science of nature, seriously relates those tales which ought to have been confined to the wigwam of the savage." Barton styled himself as a detached and objective observer with a mission to banish superstition in settler colonialist terms, claiming in a sense native knowledge of snakes didn't matter as long as it remained contained. But Barton was never so detached himself. Elsewhere in his writings, such as in one long confessional footnote, Barton apologized actually for being too squeamish to work with rattlesnakes, feeling in his own words powerless to overcome his fears. He said his fear of snakes was, quote, "the only prejudice I think I have not strength to subdue." And Barton's fears actually prevented him from working with and studying rattlesnakes as live beings for many years. Once he did, according to his reports, start to finally overcome these fears and was raising some rattlesnakes in order to study them, he actually died before he could publish his much anticipated rattlesnake book. Fear necessarily implicated observers in relations with their subjects of study, and it could foreclose the production and dissemination of knowledge altogether. So I wasn't joking with my content advisory at the beginning. I've actually had people run out of the room during my talks when I showed a simple illustration of a rattlesnake. I was actually showing Catesby's etching of a rattlesnake in that case. So the fear of snakes is real, and as shown in Barton's case and in my own experience sharing this research, it can quite tangibly disrupt human efforts to know snakes. Now, in early America, settlers always described rattlesnakes in superlatives. An English traveler in the 17th century named William Wood reported what is evil in New England. And he put the rattlesnake at the top of his list by deeming it that which was most injurious to the person and life of man, in his words. And many other authors shared Wood's sentiment. Even so, as you probably know, in the 1750s through the 1770s, rattlesnakes became these national symbols. And while early Americans were busy touting rattlesnakes and other snakes as an emblem of their courage, unity, and resolve, They were meanwhile bludgeoning rattlesnakes by the thousands through extermination campaigns that were both acutely personal at times and sponsored by human governing bodies. Towns offered bounties for their bodies. Colonial militias waged literal wars against the snakes as a step in their training, as described by Cotton Mather. John Bartram, who really harbored this exceptional sympathy for the creatures, recounted finding a rattlesnake coiled, quote, like a great mushroom. He said it peacefully slipped away even when provoked. But Bartram's guide struck him on the neck with a stick and said he never let any escape. For its last few moments of life, the snake at last began to rattle. John's son, William, later recalled encountering his first rattlesnake in the Catskills, what he called a very beautiful mottled yellow one. And he noted, "My father pleaded for his life, but our guide was inexorable, saying he never spared the life of a rattlesnake and killed him. My father took his skin and fangs." Now, the subterranean habits that made rattlesnakes kind of hard to understand, coupled with their submerged social worlds in which rattlesnakes would gather together and hibernate by the hundreds, all of these behaviors ended up making them easier prey for wide-scale extermination. And I would say this kind of scene prefigures the rattlesnake roundups that are still in practice to this day. In spring, rattlesnakes will slowly emerge from their communal hideaways. Pregnant females will collectively sunbathe together and give birth to offspring in August that they will then care for. Settlers preyed on this seasonal vulnerability by quashing rattlesnakes at alarming rates in springtime. Rattlesnakes really became this testing ground for seeing if extinction was possible at a time when its very possibility was still contested hotly in scientific circles. Thomas Jefferson believed, quote, "Such is the economy of nature that no instance can be produced of her having permitted any one race of her animals to become extinct, of her having formed any link in her great work so weak as to be broken," end quote. Yet the discussion surrounding the extermination of rattlesnakes show a robust lay belief in its physical possibility. And the ransacking of rattlesnake dens in spring may have destroyed whole family lines of snakes. Rattlesnakes were long viewed by even modern-day biologists as solitary. And in revolutionary America, the rattlesnake was prized as a national symbol, in part for its supposed rugged individualism. Recent biological studies, however, show rattlesnakes recognize and often cohabitate with their relatives. They defend their young, and they warn other snakes of danger. In the words of the biologist Rulon Clark, quote, "Snakes are often regarded as the least social of all vertebrate groups, but this assumption stems from the fact that they are secretive and difficult to observe in nature rather than any direct evidence," end quote. So rattlesnakes' so-called cryptic sociality has been more or less unknown to science until the past decade. Female snakes in particular have been shown to recognize and cuddle their sisters in preference to non-kin, even after years of separation, and many of their dens contain family groupings. Some American Indian groups in early America were very attentive to these family lines. And they were certainly aware of this subterranean world of snakes, which played an important role in their own social relations with the animals. In the early 19th century, there was a Presbyterian missionary named Cephas Washburn who recorded an oral history from a Cherokee man named Blanket. Blanket told Washburn his own philosophy for dealing with rattlesnakes was, "I never kill snakes, and so the snakes never kill me." As a young man, probably in the late 18th century, Blanket had traveled with a companion who killed a rattlesnake. And the following day, according to Blanket, a rattlesnake emissary met Blanket in the woods and invited him through an opening in some rock and into what Blanket called the subterranean abode of the serpent race. Blanket then saw the body of the rattlesnake that his friend had killed stretched before a fire in a great underground hall, while, quote, "the snake's father and mother and all the near kindred of the dead animal were making great lamentation over it. Each rattlesnake said its farewell, and they concluded the funeral rites by interring the snake with other fallen comrades." Next, Blanket witnessed the Council of Rattlesnakes debate how to secure justice for the slain animal, and they agreed that Blanket's human companion must be killed. And the importance of rattlesnake family ties became clear when they chose the murdered snake's brother as his avenger, which was decided collectively with, quote, a hiss of approbation accompanied by a concert of all the caudal rattles of the assembled multitude. Here, I think we really see some resonance with what we heard from William Bartram last night about rattlesnake kin retribution. And Blanket actually confessed to his rattlesnake guide, "I could but acknowledge this was even-handed justice and in accordance with our own Cherokee customs in similar circumstances." And Blanket then reported that his friend died from a rattlesnake bite to the heel within a week. Now, while a single account could never represent the tremendous diversity of Native viewpoints on rattlesnakes, his encounter really speaks to these mutual obligations between Cherokee individuals and rattlesnakes, obligations that held true for several American Indian groups, even as, of course, some Native Americans did kill rattlesnakes. Blanket appreciated the cryptic kin networks of rattlesnakes centuries before Anglo-American herpetologists did. His account also hints at how Native American knowledge of the subterranean habits of snakes really impinged on European efforts to exterminate the creatures. James Adair, a deerskin trader who worked with various southeastern Native groups, said of the Cherokees and rattlesnakes in his History of the American Indians, edited, of course, by our very own Catherine Brond, quote, "They reckon it so dangerous to disturb those creatures that no temptation can induce them to betray their secret recess to the profane." And Adair also noted he once saw a Chickasaw man hide a rattlesnake in a tree to prevent Adair from killing it. And there are many more instances in his account and others of how a number of southeastern Native groups in particular practiced what I would call a form of agnotology for a cause, suppressing knowledge of snake whereabouts from a population of settlers determined to purge rattlesnakes from the land. The naturalist John Bartram, this rare snake sympathizer in his day, lamented the decline of rattlesnakes. Bartram believed the destruction of wildlife was what produced myth. In 1772, he wrote in a letter that he feared if the destruction of rattlesnakes continued at its current pace, quote, "there will be but few left, and the story of a rattlesnake and its fascinating power will be in a few hundred years as little credited as the cockatrice, a legendary serpent, killing at a distance by its eyes." Now, Bartram wrote these words against the backdrop of that fascination or enchantment debate that I mentioned. And he was right. Historians invariably deny rattlesnakes this power today, deeming it a myth and lambasting the many 18th century naturalists who believed it as overly gullible. But I think this modernization narrative can unintentionally sort of reinforce the diatribes of naturalists like Benjamin Smith Barton, as Native cosmologies were a wellspring of ideas about enchantment. Furthermore, charting a steady and upward line of progress from superstition to enlightenment also really muddies both the role of human fears and the very real influence of rattlesnakes as beings. In the 18th century, animals were granted a real sort of power and agency that I think we would do well to recover and honor today, even if it was still a subject of debate at the time. And William Bartram was really at the forefront of this line of thinking. In documents I found during my research funded by the Bartram Trail Conference, Bartram called animals, quote, "ingenious little philosophers and my esteemed associates." "Can any man of sense and candor," he asked, "who has the use of his eyes, rational faculty, doubt that animals are rational creatures?" The abilities of animals were self-evident to Bartram. He believed all animals had language, for example, which implied they had intelligence, ideas, and understanding. He believed they taught their young and improved what he called their manners and arts. And they could use deduction, he insisted. Bartram thus found it, quote, "very remarkable how cautious even great men and philosophers are of allowing to animals the power and use of reason." What are they afraid of? Bartram wondered sardonically, that the spirits of animals will rise up in judgment against them for killing and eating of them? And in writing about rattlesnakes within his travels, Bartram stated, quote, "I am known to be an advocate or vindicator of the benevolent and peaceable disposition of animal creation in general." And William Bartram felt tremendous remorse and regret when he recounted killing a rattlesnake on a journey with his father in East Florida to attend the Picolata Conference of 1765, which was a treaty negotiation on the boundaries of British and Creek and Seminole lands. The slain rattlesnake was served in various dishes at the request of James Grant, the governor of East Florida, though Bartram couldn't make himself swallow the meat. This rattlesnake, in Bartram's mind, quote, "certainly had in its power to kill me almost instantly, and I make no doubt that he was conscious of it." In fact, Benjamin Smith Barton actually largely disbelieved rattlesnake enchantment because he felt that these enchantment scenes could actually be explained through appeals to both the intelligence and the morality of animals. So he interpreted enchantment as the attempt of courageous mother birds to draw the snake's attention away from their young and onto themselves using distracting movements. Fascination or enchantment seemed too mechanistic in Barton's view. In claiming these birds were in fact protecting their young, Barton found in such interactions proof of what he called the strong affections of birds and the powerful dominion of a benevolent principle in animals. In effect, Barton's conclusion was to suggest that birds were moral beings, a viewpoint that, based on manuscript material I found at the American Philosophical Society, seems to be largely drawn from our very own William Bartram's notes on the subject. As for rattlesnakes, Benjamin Smith Barton insisted that they were too intelligent to need this apparatus of enchantment. He wrote of rattlesnakes pursuing frogs, quote, "The snake lies insidiously in wait for his prey at the water edge. He employs no machinery of enchantment. He trusts to his cunning and his strength." So enchantment failed as an explanation for Barton then, not so much because it gave the snakes superpowers, but because it was too limiting. It implied the existence of a passive mechanism on the part of the snake, when in fact, Barton believed they were catching prey of their own will and design. Barton concluded it was better for a snake to be cunning than charming. William Bartram himself had some experience with the effects of rattlesnake fascination. As he reported in his published travels, he once saw a rattlesnake and felt, quote, "so shocked with surprise and horror as to be in a manner riveted to the spot, for a short time not having strength to go away." So you might be wondering at this point, how does 111.1a fit back into all of this? Thumbing through Hans Sloane's handwritten catalog of his serpent collection allows us to entertain a few different possible identities of 111.1a. I can't go through all of them in this short time, but I believe that there is some grounds for speculation that 111.1a could be the snake that disenchanted the world, the one that provided Sloane with the first supposedly empirical explanation of fascination in which enchanted animals were simply already envenomed. Some bits of what appear to be gravel line the bottom of her present bottle. And Sloane said that the rattlesnake he used to arrive at his venom hypothesis had been sent to him from Virginia in a box filled with gravel. I admit this is highly speculative, but I would argue that the very act of going through this catalog and considering the different possible identities of 111.1a forces us to see her not just as a symbol, but as an individual. By virtue of being a rattlesnake in Sloane's collection at this time, we can say with confidence that she was in some way entangled in these debates about the nature of animal power. To conclude, rattlesnakes are currently listed as endangered in a number of states, especially throughout New England, which is where I'm based right now, and they're considered extinct in Maine and Rhode Island. One reason that they persist there at all is because of their secrecy. Probably without realizing it, today's rattlesnake biologists continue a legacy initiated by Native Americans like Blanket of hiding the location of snake communities, since people to this day will go down and track down rattlesnakes and exterminate them simply because they're rattlesnakes. Conservationists hold snake dens as unutterable secrets, something to even be withheld from all documentation. And some rattlesnakes might be adapting to become even more elusive. A few very early studies are suggesting that certain species might be losing their actual rattling apparatus when they're born, and that those still with rattles might be rattling less frequently as a coping mechanism to avoid human detection and human violence. That the rattlesnake's warning, interpreted by early Americans as this miraculous gift from God, must abate in the face of human onslaught, seems ripe to make the rattlesnake itself one of John Bartram's mythical beasts, an animal oracle who tried to warn humans of coming harm. We might try listening while we still can. Thank you.